Dell Publishing was founded in 1921 by George T. Delacorte Jr., and over the years published pulp fiction magazines, paperback books, coloring books, jigsaw puzzles, and a variety of other items. The company still exists today as a major publisher of puzzle magazines. Now in 1929, Dell Comics was created as an arm of the parent company dedicated to the brand new medium of comic books. The first comic they published was titled The Funnies and was the first comic book to feature original material rather than reprints of newspaper comic strips. In 1938, Dell formed a partnership with Western Printing and Lithographing Company, which held the rights to do comic books based on popular characters from other media. As of 1940, this would include Walt Disney characters such as Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. The Disney cartoon shorts were enormously popular in movie theaters at the time. So comic books featuring these characters had a built-in audience. Western would employ writers and artists and actually produce the comic books, while Dell would then distribute them to the newsstand. Writer and comics historian Mark Avenir gives this account of how the process came to work. Quote, once or twice a year, Western's reps would go to the Dell people with mock-ups and samples for new proposed comics. Someone at Dell, usually their president, Helen Meyer, would order more comics from the Western. She might say, okay, let's do another 12 issues of Looney Tunes next year, 6 of Andy Panda. Let's try 2 issues of that new Rocky and his friends thing you brought in. And so on. Western's folks would then scurry back to their offices in New York and Los Angeles and get the writers and artists busy on creating the insides of those books. Later, they would print them. Dell would pay all the costs, including printing and a profit for Western, and handle distribution and financing of the books. Unquote. Throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, Western continued to publish Dell Comics in many different genres based on a variety of sources. Movies, children's television shows, adult television shows, newspaper comic strips, novels, and so on. During the 1950s, Dell's Disney comics, especially the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics written and drawn by Carl Barks, were often the best-selling comics in the industry and are still considered some of the finest comics ever produced. Now, during this time period, there was no such thing as a comic book specialty shop. Someone wanting to buy a comic would find them at newsstands and drugstore magazine racks. So publishers would often depend on having eye-catching covers to make their comics stand out. Now, comics based on TV shows and movies often used photo covers of the stars as their selling points. But Dell was one of the few companies that also used painted covers. Often, these covers were beautifully composed illustrations. The artists who worked for Dell doing covers included Ernest Nordell, Henry Hartman, and Don Spaulding. In addition to their many licensed properties, Dell did produce a few comics featuring original characters. The most notable and longest lasting was Turok, Son of Stone. Based on the most purely geeky idea ever conceived, the comic followed the adventures of a pre-Columbian Indian named Turok and his friend Andar as they tried to find their way out of a lost valley populated by dinosaurs and cavemen. Featuring magnificent painted covers, often done by artist George Wilson, these stories depended heavily on the popularity of dinosaurs among kids, but they were often cleverly written, emphasizing Turok's ingenuity and his father-son relationship with young Andar. Now in 1962, Dell and Western Printing had a falling out over financial issues. Western started its own comic book company called Gold Key Comics. Gold Key took over publication of both the licensed properties and the original characters. One month, the logos on the covers were for Dell. The next month, they were for Gold Key. Now, Dell Comics continued on for 11 years, licensing properties for newer TV shows and producing some original comics. But eventually their parent company closed them up. So our story will now continue with Gold Key. Now, in addition to Turok, Gold Key added several other original characters to their publishing schedule. There was the post-nuclear war hero Marty Sampson, created in 1962 by writer Otto Binder and artist Frank Thorne. Magnus, Robot Fighter, was a science fiction hero created by writer-artist Russ Manning in 1963. A later arrival was Dagar the Invincible, created by writer Donald Glut in 1972 in response to the growing popularity of sword and sorcery heroes such as Conan the Barbarian. The Space Family Robinson began its run in 1962, created by writer Dell Connell and artist Dan Spiegel. It was loosely based on the classic novel Swiss Family Robinson, about a family stranded on a tropical island. In the comics, the family was stranded in space. In 1965, the television network CBS began airing a show titled Lost in Space, about a family named Robinson that was, unsurprisingly, lost in space. Normally, Gold Key would have been first in line to produce a comic book based on that series, but they were already publishing something very similar. Gold Key executives felt the TV show was at least partially inspired by the comic book, but Irwin Allen, the creator of the series, denied this. A settlement was reached that allowed Gold Key to use Lost in Space as part of the title on their comic book, even though it featured different characters than the TV show. Thus, unlike most TV shows from the 1960s, Lost in Space did not have a direct comic book adaptation at the time of its original network airing. Gold Key continued to use often beautifully painted covers for many of their comics, occasionally doing so even with some of the comics based on TV shows, in lieu of the photo covers that were usually used for TV-based comics. Now, another notable comic published by Gold Key was Tarzan of the Apes. Beginning in 1965, artist Russ Manning wrote and illustrated a number of issues based directly on some of the original Tarzan novels. Now, these are considered by many fans of Tarzan to be among some of the best adaptations of the character ever produced, with great covers, good writing, and strong interior art. Now, Gold Key also published the first comic book version of the television series Star Trek. Though at first, the comic was infamous for being written and drawn by people unfamiliar with the show, which led to some very poor storytelling. Even so, Gold Key's Star Trek book ran intermittently for 61 issues from 1967 to 1979, when Marvel Comics then obtained the license for the show. During the 1970s, the comic book industry took a downturn and Gold Key began to lose readers. They hung on through the decade with Star Trek and with occasional books based on new licensed properties, such as the TV show Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. They also experimented with digest-sized reprints of older stories with some commercial success. In 1981, low sales forced Gold Key to cease newsstand distribution. For a time, their comics were distributed in toy stores and other retail outlets in bags of 3 comics each, with a Whitman Comics logo in place of Gold Key, Whitman being another arm of the parent company, Western Printing. But they closed up shop completely in 1984. Today, the original Gold Key characters are owned by Dark Horse Comics, and the library has several volumes of reprints that Dark Horse has recently published. These include Tarzan, Turok, The Space Family Robinson, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Boris Karloff Mysteries, and The Phantom, as well as Mighty Samson and Dagar the Invincible. We also have several volumes of the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics drawn by Carl Barks that Dell originally published in the 1950s. These are examples of graphic storytelling from a time when non-superhero comic books were a much more important part of our popular culture, representing sincere and unpretentious efforts to tell entertaining stories.